Hello, this video is going to go over how to set up local multiplayer using the new Unity input system. And to get started, I've prepared a little bit of an example of a basic character controller that can move around. It uses the Unity built-in character controller collider. And I'm going to start this by going over the adventure script itself. We have a speed, jump speed, gravity, a move vector. So this is where we're going to apply input to the character cached controller. Just so we have a reference to the character controller collider. And a basic fixed update loop that does best practices for moving around the character controller, meaning that if it's not on the ground, then we apply gravity, and we move it based on the velocity, which is set at the beginning by its current velocity. And we also clamp move to a normalized vector of -1 to 1 in any direction, which means that if we were pushing diagonally on a joystick, for example, you would get a -1 and 1 depending on the joystick, or a 1-1, which would result in a larger than 1 move vector. So we normalize that and then multiply it against speed to get our velocity vector, and then apply it and so on. Anyway. Just to show that working, if we take the move vector, we can move the character around, and it does its job. Okay, so how do we hook up input system actions to this in a way that's friendly for local multiplayer? Well, the first thing we need to do is create a new input actions asset. I'm going to call this adventure actions. Because this is local multiplayer, we are expecting there to be different gamepads and maybe even a keyboard user. All sorts of crazy stuff's going to show up. So we're going to create a control scheme. I'm going to call this gamepad, and I'm going to add a gamepad requirement. So this is where you would look through this list and say, okay, I need my game specifically requires I don't know, a fight stick in order to use this layout. But in this case, I've got gamepads plugged in, so I'm going to choose the generic gamepad, not Xbox, not PS4, generic gamepad. And I'm going to mark this as required. Optional means that when we go through device detection in a minute, anything in this list could potentially trigger a player to join and pair with a device. So by setting it to be required, only devices that registered with the system as a gamepad, by default that is a PS4 controller and an Xbox controller only, will actually trip the device detection for this control scheme. Anyway, I'm going to create a new action map, and we're going to call this default. And we're going to call our first action move, and move will be a vector 2, or stick, or D-pad, whatever. Let's use vector 2. And we're going to bind it to something on the gamepad. So you could go all the way into here. I typically already have a gamepad plugged in, so I choose listen and move the thing I want. This is another important decision. The listen menu will return a gamepad and an Xbox controller. This is obviously the same device, but if you choose Xbox controller, it will only listen to Xbox controllers. It will not listen to PS4 or any other input device. So we want to choose left stick gamepad. So that is a generic gamepad. It doesn't care what device it is, it's just going to listen to it. I'm also going to add a jump with the action type of button. And bind path. Again, choose listen, push the button. And here we see it's like A on the Xbox. Yeah, okay, but button south on generic gamepad. And we also see that it's used in control scheme because we set all that up. And I'm going to choose save asset here. And we'll come back to adding keyboard in a minute. So now back to our adventure object. The preferred way for me to get started with local multiplayer using InputSystem is to use the player input component. That's kind of the built-in way of saying this is a player, it's paired with a device, and it's isolated from all the other controllers. It only pairs with a specific device or set of devices. So I'm going to add a player input component, and it wants an action asset. So I'm going to give it the one that we just created. And it's going to say default scheme. We're going to say any because eventually we're going to want a keyboard player to join. Auto switch, yeah, sure. Default map, because that's the only one we have. Input module and camera, don't worry about those yet. And then behavior. This is where things get a little interesting. I'm going to set this to invoke Unity events for a very specific reason. Send messages is very quick and easy to set up, but it doesn't actually send you all of the unique and interesting messages that come with things like the hold interaction or the tap interaction. Sometimes it's really important that you get those, so Unity events is probably the easiest way to get started with this. C# events, as well as just tapping the input action callbacks itself, is more advanced and, again, more powerful, but Unity events is a pretty straightforward way to get started. Inside of the events dropdown, you'll get another dropdown for your default action map where we get a move and jump callback. So as you would expect, we probably need to put those in the Adventure script. So let's get started with that. At the very top of this, I'm going to include using Unity engine input system. I don't think we need callbacks yet. No. And I'm going to create a new callback for when the joystick is updated. So we'll call this on move updated. And this will be a input action callback context. And that will give us information about the phase of the callback, whether it was performed, whether it was canceled, so on and so forth. And I will read that value and store it directly into the move variable. So we can say move equals context, read value of type vector2. And now we're filling data into the move vector for our character. And when we start playback, nothing will happen because we haven't actually called that function. So we need to go in and add a listener to the default event. In this case, it is the adventurer. And it is the adventurer. Oh, did I not make it public? I didn't make it public. This function must be public for the Unity event to find it. Adventure. Oh, it's not quite on the screen. Thanks, OBS. Adventure on move updated. There we go. So now when we start playback and we move the stick, those values are filled into the move vector. All right, let's look at jump real quick, because buttons are a little bit different. This is fine for the move vector because it's just constantly updated. We don't really need any frame-specific information like, did the user press the jump button on this frame? Should they jump right now? Should they jump later? Are they on the ground? So on. We just fill the data in and let it happen on the next fixed update. Unlike the old input system, where you were able to do something like input get button down just in line with your code, whether that was on fixed update or update, you are generally supposed to use callbacks with the new input system because it actually handles frame rate independent input, which is fantastic news. That's actually something that's really difficult to accomplish sometimes. So to ingest the jump, we need to understand a couple things. One, the jump event is read at whatever rate the input system is running at, and that is controlled by a couple settings. And even the polling rate of the device is different. Like an Xbox controller is substantially slower polling than a PS4 controller, which is even slower than something like a really high-end flight stick or even fight pad. So the input system kind of puts all those together and processes them and gives you callbacks when it's supposed to. But because of that, you need to cache the input and do something with it. So I'm going to create a private variable called shouldJump, and I'm going to make a new callback here called onJump input action callback context. And in this case, we want to do a couple things. One, we want to cache the value, but I only really want to cache this that the character is currently on the ground. You shouldn't be able to jump, or you generally shouldn't be able to jump, depending on the game you're playing. If you're holding the jump button down and you're in the air, do you jump immediately? Nah, let's wait till we're on the ground. So when we get here, we want to make sure if controller is grounded, then we check. So if context dot phase equals input action phase dot performed, and context dot read value as button will give us back a bool if it passed the threshold for a button. That's important if you're using a trigger, an analog trigger for a button press. That value can sometimes be set as a hair trigger, sometimes it's halfway depressed, so on. Those are all things you can configure inside the system. So if our phase is performed and our context read values button is true, then the user definitely just pushed the jump button, and shouldJump is now equal to true. So now down here in our code, we can say if shouldJump, we consume the jump event, and then we set velocity.y equal to our jump speed. Back into Unity, hook up our jump event. Again, back to the adventurer. I know it's off the screen, believe me, it's there. And now when we go back into play mode and make the character jump, it jumps. All right, now we've got a functional character. So, how do we do local multiplayer? Well, player input actually makes this really easy because it handles a paired device list and automatically subscribing and unsubscribing from the actions that you want. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a prefab out of our adventure, delete it from the scene, create a new game object, call it player input manager, for example, and add the player input manager behavior. And it wants a join behavior, in this case, join player when a button is pressed, join player is when an action is triggered, join players manually. I'm just going to leave that as default and drag the adventurer prefab in there. There's some other parameters in here, like limit number of players, that are capped to 4, because why not? And notification behavior, same deal as player input. It'll give you a on player joined, on player left if you want to do something like set a spawn point. But with join players when button is pressed, hit the go button. When I hit the keyboard, nothing happens. When I push a gamepad button, it joins. Variable controller of... That happened a little early there. I think those callbacks might have been called before the object had initialized, because start happens a little bit later. Let's try to use awake and see if that still happens. Oh, still. Those callbacks are getting called real early. Wow. Okay. I think that might actually be a proper bug. Anyway, they work just fine after that. But the idea is that the player prefab has a player input component on it. That's a requirement. So that when you join a player, ignore the errors, it is paired with a device. So this adventure can be seen as user 0, input user 0. That's a whole other thing. Control scheme, gamepad, devices, Xbox input controller with the actual device it's been paired to. So now when I push a button on another controller, bam, there's another player. And they are properly bonded to the right device, and they make user 1, they have a clone of the input action asset, and they're pretty much good to go. Can both jump, so on and so forth. And in the next video, I'm going to cover the multi-user event system for dealing with menus, and how to pass control back and forth from being able to move the player to a UI element or merge them, so on and so forth. All right, see ya.